June 4th, 1940, 2:20, 2 minutes past 10 in the morning, and Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky is flying his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber at 14,000 feet above the empty Pacific Ocean, and he is lost. McClusky has been searching for the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet for over an hour, crisscrossing hundreds of square miles of ocean, burning fuel that he desperately needs to get back to his own carrier, USS Enterprise, which is somewhere far behind him. His fuel gauge shows maybe 15 minutes of flying time remaining before he will have to ditch in the ocean and hope for rescue. Behind McClusky, 30, 2 more dive bombers are following him in formation, their pilots also watching their fuel gauges drop toward empty, also realizing that they might have failed in their mission and might die in the ocean far from home. American intelligence had promised that the Japanese carriers would be at a specific location at a specific time, but when McClusky arrived at that location, the ocean was empty. The Japanese had changed course. McClusky has been searching ever since, flying search patterns, looking for any sign of the enemy fleet, finding nothing but endless blue water. McClusky knows he should turn back now before his fuel runs out completely, but turning back means abandoning the mission, means failing to stop the Japanese attack on Midway Island, means possibly losing the entire Pacific War. McClusky makes the decision to search for just a few more minutes, gambling with his life and the lives of his pilots. Then McClusky sees something far below, a thin white line on the blue ocean surface, the wake of a ship moving at high speed. McClusky dives lower to investigate and sees a Japanese destroyer racing northwest alone, leaving that distinctive wake. McClusky makes an instant decision based on intuition and desperation. He follows the destroyer, gambling that it is heading toward the Japanese carriers, gambling that the Japanese fleet is northwest of his current position, gambling everything on this one slim chance. 7 minutes later, at exactly 2 minutes past 10 in the morning on June 4th, 1940, Wade McClusky and his dive bombers climb over a thin cloud layer and see below them the most important target in the Pacific War. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers arranged in a loose box formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft, their escorting battleships and cruisers surrounding them in defensive positions. The entire pride of the Japanese combined fleet spread out below like a model on a planning table. McClusky has found them, and at exactly the same moment, by pure chance that no one planned and no one could have predicted, another group of American dive bombers from USS Yorktown arrives from a different direction and also sees the Japanese carriers. 2 American dive bomber squadrons arriving from different carriers at different times by different routes have converged on the Japanese fleet at exactly the same instant. McClusky looks down and sees that the Japanese carriers are completely vulnerable. Their fighter cover, the deadly Zero fighters that have dominated every air battle since Pearl Harbor, are all at low altitude far below, chasing American torpedo bombers that attacked minutes earlier. There are no Japanese fighters at high altitude to defend against dive bombers. The carrier flight decks are covered with aircraft being prepared for launch. Fuel hoses are connected, ammunition is stacked, bombs are sitting exposed. Everything is perfectly arranged for maximum catastrophe. McClusky radios his dive bombers with 2 words that will change history: attack immediately. The American dive bombers roll over into their attack dives, pushing their noses down into 70-degree dives, accelerating toward terminal velocity, screaming down from 14,000 feet toward the Japanese carriers 4 miles below. The dive bomber pilots center their targets in their bomb sights, watching the carriers grow larger and larger in their windscreens, waiting for the perfect moment to release their 1,000-pound bombs. At 3,000 feet altitude, the dive bomber pilots release their bombs and pull out of their dives, pulling so hard that they black out from the G-forces, pulling up and away from the anti-aircraft fire that is finally starting to reach toward them. The bombs fall for another few seconds, tumbling through the air, stabilizing, accelerating, guided by nothing but gravity and the skill of the pilots who aimed them. Then the bombs hit. The first bomb strikes the Japanese carrier Kaga just behind the forward elevator, penetrates the wooden flight deck, and explodes inside the hangar deck where aircraft are being fueled and armed. The explosion ignites aviation fuel and detonates bombs and torpedoes that were being loaded onto the aircraft. A secondary explosion rips through Kaga's entire forward section, blowing aircraft and sailors off the deck, sending a fireball 500 feet into the air. More bombs hit Kaga within seconds, each explosion starting more fires, each fire spreading to more fuel and ammunition. Within 3 minutes, Kaga is burning from bow to stern, her entire flight deck engulfed in flames, explosions continuing as ammunition detonates. The carrier transformed from a functional warship into a floating inferno. At exactly the same moment, other dive bombers are attacking the carrier Akagi, flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet, the ship from which the Pearl Harbor attack was launched 6 months earlier. Bombs hit Akagi's flight deck and explode among the aircraft waiting for launch. Akagi's hangar deck becomes a sea of burning fuel. The carrier's ammunition magazines begin exploding. Within minutes, Akagi is also burning uncontrollably. And while Kaga and Akagi are dying, the dive bombers from Yorktown are attacking the carrier Soryu. Their bombs hit perfectly, 3 direct hits in rapid succession, each bomb penetrating the flight deck and exploding inside the hangar. Soryu's aviation fuel ignites. Her aircraft explode. Her crew begins abandoning ship within minutes because there is no hope of saving her. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers are burning and sinking at the same time, destroyed in the same 3-minute period, destroyed by bombs delivered by pilots who found them by luck as much as skill, destroyed at the moment of maximum vulnerability because the timing of the American attack happened to coincide with the moment when the Japanese were most exposed. If the American dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Japanese fighters would have been at high altitude and would have shot them down. If the American dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes later, the Japanese would have launched their strike and the carriers would have been less vulnerable. But the dive bombers arrived at exactly 10:20, 2 in the morning on June 4, 1942, at the one perfect moment when everything aligned, and in 3 minutes they destroyed Japan's naval supremacy forever. The Battle of Midway is being decided right now in these 3 minutes, and Japan is losing. The war in the Pacific has just changed. Nothing will ever be the same. December 7th, 1941, a date that President Franklin Roosevelt said would live in infamy, and he was absolutely right. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans, destroyed or damaged 8 battleships, and brought the United States into World War II. The attack was intended to cripple the American Pacific Fleet so severely that the United States would be unable to interfere with Japan's planned conquests in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically because the most important targets escaped. The 3 American aircraft carriers based at Pearl Harbor, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were not in port on December 7th. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea delivering aircraft to Midway and Wake Islands. Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing maintenance. The Japanese attackers sank battleships, but the carriers survived, and carriers, not battleships, would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this immediately. He told his staff that they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. Yamamoto knew that the attack had not destroyed America's ability to fight, only delayed it. The American carriers were still out there, and they would seek revenge. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Japanese forces conquered the Philippines, defeating American and Filipino forces in brutal fighting, and forcing General Douglas MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. Japan conquered the British colonies of Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, capturing over 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops. Japan conquered the Dutch East Indies, securing access to the oil fields that Japan desperately needed to continue the war. Japan conquered countless Pacific islands, pushing the defensive perimeter thousands of miles from the Japanese home islands. By April 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands near Alaska to the waters north of Australia. It was the largest empire Japan had ever possessed, achieved in just 4 months of nearly continuous victories. Japanese propaganda proclaimed that Japan was invincible, that the empire of the rising sun would dominate Asia for 1,000 years, that the weak Western powers could never defeat Japanese military might. The Japanese people believed the propaganda because everything they were told seemed to be true. Japan was winning everywhere. America was retreating everywhere. Victory seemed inevitable. But Admiral Yamamoto knew better. Yamamoto had lived in the United States before the war, had studied at Harvard, had traveled across America observing its industrial capacity. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a long war against the United States because American industrial production was 10 times larger than Japan's. America could build ships and aircraft faster than Japan could sink them. America could train pilots faster than Japan could kill them. Japan's only chance of winning the Pacific War was to destroy the American Pacific Fleet completely in the first 6 months of the war, then negotiate a peace treaty that would allow Japan to keep its conquests. The Pearl Harbor attack had failed to achieve this goal because the American carriers survived. Yamamoto needed to finish what Pearl Harbor started. He needed to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle and sink them before American industrial production could replace them. Yamamoto began planning a new operation, a massive attack that would force the Americans to commit their carriers to battle. The target would be Midway Atoll, a small island group 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was important because it was the westernmost American base in the Pacific, a potential staging point for attacks on Japan itself. More importantly, Yamamoto believed that the Americans would defend Midway with everything they had, including their precious aircraft carriers. If Japan attacked Midway, the American carriers would have to respond, and when they did, Yamamoto would destroy them. Yamamoto assembled the largest naval force in history for the Midway operation. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, carrying over 250 aircraft and the most experienced pilots in the world. 2 light carriers, Yujo and Junyo, carrying another 80 aircraft. 7 battleships including the massive Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers, 10 submarines, over 200 ships total, carrying over 100,000 sailors and soldiers. The plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to draw American attention north, followed by the main attack on Midway. Japanese carrier aircraft would destroy Midway's defenses, then Japanese troops would land and capture the atoll. When the American carriers arrived to defend Midway, Japanese carriers and battleships would ambush them and sink them. Yamamoto was so confident of victory that he scheduled a celebration ceremony for June 7th, 3 days after the attack, when he expected Midway to be in Japanese hands and the American carriers to be on the ocean floor. The operation was codenamed MI, and it was supposed to end the Pacific War by destroying America's ability to fight. But Yamamoto's plan had a fatal flaw that he did not know about. The Americans were reading his mail. While Admiral Yamamoto was planning the Midway operation in Tokyo, American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor were reading Japanese naval communications and trying to figure out what Japan was planning next. Station Hypo was a secret code-breaking unit located in the basement of the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, where a team of mathematicians, linguists, and intelligence officers worked 24 hours a day intercepting and deciphering Japanese radio messages. The Japanese Navy used a code system called JN-25, an extremely complex cipher that encrypted messages using thousands of 5, digit code groups that had to be deciphered using massive codebooks and mathematical analysis. JN-20-5 was supposed to be unbreakable, and for a long time it was, but by April 1942, the station hypo codebreakers had broken enough of JN-20-5 to read portions of Japanese messages, not every word, but enough fragments to understand the general meaning. The code-breaking operation was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant intelligence officer who lived in the basement with his team, sleeping a few hours a day, wearing a smoking jacket and slippers to work, chain, smoking cigarettes, obsessively analyzing every intercepted message looking for patterns and clues. In late April and early May 1942, Station Hypo began intercepting Japanese messages referring to a major operation planned for early June. The messages mentioned an objective code named AF but did not specify what AF was. Rochefort suspected that AF meant Midway Atoll because other intelligence suggested Japan was planning an operation in the Central Pacific. But suspicion was not proof, and American commanders needed certainty before committing their limited naval forces to defend Midway. If Rochefort was wrong about AF, if the Japanese were actually planning to attack somewhere else like Hawaii or the West Coast, then defending Midway would leave other areas vulnerable. Rochefort needed to confirm that AF was definitely Midway, and he devised an ingenious plan to do exactly that. Rochefort proposed that Midway Island send a fake radio message in plain English, a message that the Japanese would intercept, reporting that Midway's water desalination plant had broken down and the island was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then sent a coded message mentioning that AF was short of water, it would prove that AF was Midway. The plan was approved. On May 22nd, Midway sent the fake message. Station Hypo waited tensely, hoping the Japanese would take the bait. 2 days later, on May 24th, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water and requesting that supply ships bring extra water for the invasion force. The trap worked perfectly. AF was definitely Midway. Rochefort had his proof. He briefed Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, on the Japanese plan. The Japanese would attack Midway on June 4th with 4 carriers and overwhelming force. Japanese carriers would launch airstrikes beginning early morning June 4th to destroy Midway's defenses. Japanese landing forces would invade the atoll. The Japanese expected the American carriers to respond and planned to ambush them with superior numbers. Nimitz listened to Rochefort's briefing and made a decision that would determine the outcome of the war. Nimitz would not wait to respond after the Japanese attacked Midway. Instead, he would position the American carriers northeast of Midway before the Japanese arrived, waiting in ambush, reversing the trap. The Americans would ambush the Japanese instead of the Japanese ambushing the Americans. But Nimitz had a problem. He had only 3 carriers available. Saratoga was still being repaired on the west coast. Lexington had been sunk a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. That left only Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. And Yorktown had been heavily damaged at the Coral Sea and needed months of repairs. Nimitz ordered the Pearl Harbor shipyard to repair Yorktown in 3 days. The shipyard workers said it was impossible. Nimitz said do it anyway. For 72 hours, 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed over Yorktown, working around the clock in shifts, welding damaged hull plates, repairing destroyed compartments, replacing damaged machinery, working so fast that some repairs were unfinished when Yorktown sailed on May 30th. But Yorktown was operational enough to fight, and Nimitz needed every carrier he could get. Enterprise and Hornet had sortied on May 28th. Yorktown joined them on May 30th. The 3 American carriers took position northeast of Midway, exactly where Rochefort's intelligence said they needed to be to intercept the Japanese fleet. The Americans had 233 aircraft total. The Japanese had 4 carriers with 258 aircraft plus the support of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Americans were outnumbered in ships and aircraft, but the Americans had 3 critical advantages. First, they knew exactly when and where the Japanese were coming. Second, they were already in position waiting. Third, the Japanese did not know the American carriers were nearby. Admiral Yamamoto believed the American carriers were still near Hawaii, 1,000 miles away, and would not arrive until June 7th, 3 days after the attack on Midway. Yamamoto thought he had total surprise. He was wrong. The Americans were waiting for him, hidden over the horizon, ready to attack the moment the Japanese carriers were vulnerable. The codebreakers had given the Americans the information they needed to set the perfect trap. Now the pilots would have to spring it. June 4th, 1940, to 4:30 in the morning, and a PBY Catalina flying boat on patrol from Midway Island spots the Japanese invasion fleet 200 miles northwest of Midway and radios back. Many planes heading Midway. The battle has begun. At Midway Island, air raid sirens wail and every available aircraft scrambles to either intercept the incoming Japanese bombers or evacuate before they are destroyed on the ground. Midway has 112 aircraft including obsolete fighters, old dive bombers and long-range patrol planes. The Midway aircraft are not capable of stopping the Japanese attack, but they can delay it and hopefully damage some Japanese ships. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, positioned 200 miles northeast of Midway, Admiral Spruance receives the contact report and orders an immediate full strike against the Japanese carriers. Every available aircraft will launch and attack the Japanese fleet before the Japanese discover the American carriers and attack them. Speed is critical. Whoever strikes first will have an enormous advantage. Spruance is gambling everything on a massive alpha strike, throwing every aircraft he has at the Japanese carriers, hoping to overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers. The American carriers begin launching aircraft at 7 o'clock in the morning. Enterprise and Hornet launch dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Yorktown launches her aircraft an hour later. The problem is that the American aircraft are not coordinated. The different aircraft types have different speeds and ranges. The fighters fly faster than the bombers. The torpedo bombers fly slower than everyone else. The plan is for all the aircraft to rendezvous over the carriers, form up into coordinated strike groups, then fly together to attack the Japanese fleet. But the plan breaks down immediately. Some aircraft cannot find the rendezvous point. Some commanders decide not to wait for slower aircraft and proceed toward the target independently. The result is that the American strike becomes fragmented into separate groups arriving at different times. Coordination is lost. The first aircraft to find the Japanese fleet are the torpedo bombers from Hornet, 15 Douglas TBD Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron's squadron, known as Torpedo Squadron 8, arrives over the Japanese fleet at 9:30 in the morning and immediately attacks alone without fighter cover and without waiting for dive bombers. Waldron knows this is suicidal, but he attacks anyway because those are his orders, and because delaying would give the Japanese more time to prepare defenses. Torpedo Squadron 8 flies low over the water toward the Japanese carriers, skimming the waves at 100 feet altitude, trying to get close enough to launch their torpedoes. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire converge on the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers. One by one, the Devastators are shot down. Waldron's aircraft explodes in flames. Another Devastator disintegrates under machine gun fire. Another crashes into the ocean. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 are destroyed. Every single one. Only one man survives, Ensign George Gay, whose aircraft crashes into the ocean, but who manages to swim away and hide under a floating seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle from the water. Torpedo Squadron 8 is annihilated without scoring a single torpedo hit on any Japanese ship. But their sacrifice is not meaningless. The torpedo attack draws the Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude, pulling the Zero fighters away from high altitude where they would be positioned to defend against dive bombers. And at exactly 10:22 a.m., while the Japanese Zeros are still at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers, Wade McClusky's dive bombers arrive at 14,000 feet with no fighters to stop them. Torpedo Squadron 8 died so the dive bombers could live. Their sacrifice creates the opening that wins the battle. 10:20, 2 in the morning, June 4, 1942, and Wade McClusky finally finds the Japanese carriers after searching for over an hour and nearly running out of fuel. McClusky radios his dive bombers. Attack. 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise roll over into their attack dives, pushing their noses down into 70-degree dives, accelerating toward terminal velocity. Wind screaming past the canopies, engines roaring, altimeters unwinding rapidly as the aircraft plunged toward the ocean below. At exactly the same moment, by pure coincidence, 17 more dive bombers from Yorktown arrive from a different direction and also begin attacking. The Japanese carriers have no warning. Their radar, if they even turned it on, does not detect aircraft at high altitude. Their fighter cover is at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers. Their carriers are in the middle of rearming and refueling aircraft for a strike against the American carriers which the Japanese have finally located. The Japanese carrier decks are covered with aircraft, fuel hoses, ammunition carts, bombs and torpedoes. Everything is perfectly arranged for catastrophe. McClusky's dive bombers target the carriers Kaga and Akagi. The Yorktown dive bombers target Soryu. The dive bomber pilots center their targets in their bomb sights, watching the carriers grow larger and larger as they fall toward them. At 3,000 feet altitude, the pilots release their 1,000-pound bombs and immediately pull out of their dives, pulling so hard that some pilots black out from the G-forces. The bombs continue falling, guided only by the accuracy of the bomber pilot's aim in the 3 seconds before release. The bombs are not guided, they are not smart. They are simply steel cylinders filled with high explosive, tumbling through the air, accelerating under gravity, on trajectories calculated by the pilot's skill and experience. Some bombs miss, hitting the water near the carriers and exploding harmlessly. But some bombs hit, and those hits are devastating. The first bomb hits Kaga near the forward elevator, penetrates the wooden flight deck, and explodes inside the hangar deck where aircraft are being fueled. The explosion ignites gasoline that has spilled on the hangar deck. Fire spreads instantly. A second bomb hits Kaga amidships, exploding among the aircraft packed on the flight deck, detonating the bombs and torpedoes that are sitting exposed waiting to be loaded onto aircraft. The secondary explosion rips through Kaga's entire forward section, blowing aircraft into the air, killing everyone on the forward flight deck instantly, sending a fireball hundreds of feet high. A third bomb hits Kaga's aft section, starting more fires. Within minutes, Kaga is burning from bow to stern. The crew tries to fight the fires, but it is hopeless. The fires are spreading faster than they can be contained. Ammunition begins cooking off, exploding randomly. The bridge is filled with smoke. Sailors are abandoning ship, jumping into the ocean to escape the flames. Kaga is dying. At the same moment, other dive bombers are attacking Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet, the carrier that launched the Pearl Harbor attack. 2 bombs hit Akagi's flight deck in rapid succession. The first bomb explodes among the aircraft waiting for launch, starting fires. The second bomb penetrates to the hangar deck and explodes among the aircraft being armed below. Akagi's hangar becomes an inferno. Aviation fuel burns at temperatures hot enough to melt metal. The carrier's structure begins to fail. Ammunition magazines explode. Admiral Nagumo, commander of the carrier fleet, is forced to evacuate the bridge and transfer his flag to a cruiser because Akagi is dying around him. And while Kaga and Akagi burn, the Yorktown dive bombers are attacking Soryu. 3 bombs hit Soryu in quick succession, all 3 penetrating to the hangar deck, all 3 starting uncontrollable fires. Soryu's crew abandoned ship within 15 minutes because there is no hope of saving her. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in 3 minutes. Japan's naval supremacy in the Pacific destroyed in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee. The battle is not over yet. 1 Japanese carrier, Hiryu, survived because she was operating separately from the other 3 and was not in position when the dive bombers attacked. Hiryu will counterattack and severely damage Yorktown. But Hiryu will also be found and sunk later in the day. By sunset on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers will be sinking or sunk. Japan has lost the Battle of Midway, lost control of the Pacific, and lost any chance of winning World War II. While Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning, the 4th Japanese carrier Hiryu was operating 10 miles away and was not hit by the American dive bomber attack. Hiryu's captain immediately launched a counterattack against the American carriers. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had finally located the American fleet, and Hiryu sent every available aircraft to attack. 18 dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from Hiryu at 10:50 a.m. and flew toward the last known position of the American carriers. The Japanese pilots were among the best in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor and 6 months of continuous combat. They were angry about the loss of their sister carriers and determined to avenge them. At noon, the Japanese aircraft found USS Yorktown and attacked through heavy anti-aircraft fire and American fighter cover. Despite losses, several Japanese dive bombers broke through and scored 3 direct hits on Yorktown. The bombs exploded deep inside the carrier, starting fires, knocking out boilers, flooding compartments. Yorktown lost power and went dead in the water. The crew fought desperately to save their ship, and they succeeded in restoring partial power. Yorktown was damaged but still afloat. Then at 2:45 p.m., a second wave from Hiryu attacked Yorktown with torpedo bombers. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown's port side, tearing massive holes in the hull, flooding the engine rooms. Yorktown began listing heavily. The captain ordered abandon ship, and the crew evacuated. Yorktown would sink 2 days later after being torpedoed again by a Japanese submarine. But Yorktown's sacrifice bought time for the other American carriers to locate and destroy Hiryu. American search aircraft from Enterprise found Hiryu at 2:45 p.m. and radioed her position. Enterprise and Hornet immediately launched dive bombers. 4 dive bombers from Enterprise arrived over Hiryu at 5 p.m. and attacked through intense anti-aircraft fire. 4 bombs hit Hiryu, penetrating her flight deck and exploding in the hangar, starting the same kind of uncontrollable fires that had doomed the other Japanese carriers. Hiryu's crew fought the fires all night, but could not contain them. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu's captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. Japanese destroyers rescued the survivors, then torpedoed Hiryu to scuttle her. She sank at 9 a.m. on June 5th. All 4 Japanese carriers that attacked Midway were now on the ocean floor. Japan had also lost 1 heavy cruiser, sunk by American aircraft, and 258 aircraft destroyed or lost when the carriers sank. 3,500 Japanese sailors and pilots were dead. The Japanese combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier, was retreating toward Japan in defeat, having lost 1/3 of its carrier strength in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato far from the battle, received the reports and realized that the Midway operation had failed catastrophically. He cancelled the invasion and ordered all Japanese forces to retreat. The decisive battle that was supposed to destroy the American carriers and end the war had instead destroyed Japan's carriers and changed the entire course of the war. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942, when the last Japanese ships retreated beyond range of American aircraft. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The Japanese had lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 258 aircraft, and 3,500 men. The numbers tell the story. Japan lost 4 carriers and America lost 1. Japan lost trained pilots who could not be replaced. America lost aircraft that could be replaced from production lines that were turning out new planes every day. More importantly, Japan lost the strategic initiative. Before Midway, Japan was on the offensive, conquering territory, expanding the empire. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive, trying to hold what it had already taken. The shift from offense to defense is psychologically devastating for any military because it means accepting that victory is no longer possible, that the best outcome is to avoid defeat. Japan would fight desperately for 3 more years, but after Midway, Japan was fighting not to win but to avoid losing, and that is a battle that cannot be won. The Battle of Midway changed the Pacific War in ways that were not immediately obvious, but became clear over the following months and years. First, Midway stopped Japan's expansion. Japan had planned to capture Midway as a base for attacking Hawaii. After Midway, those plans were abandoned. Japan would never again threaten Hawaii or the American West Coast. Second, Midway gave America time to build up forces for a counteroffensive. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan itself. That campaign would not have been possible if Japan still had 4 carriers and controlled the Pacific. Third, Midway destroyed Japan's best carrier pilots. Aircraft carriers are useless without trained pilots, and training carrier pilots takes years. Japan could build new carriers, but replacing the 3,000 pilots and aircrew lost at Midway and in the subsequent battles took time that Japan did not have. By 1943, American pilots were becoming more experienced, while Japanese pilots were becoming less experienced because Japan was losing its veterans faster than it could train replacements. Fourth, Midway proved that American intelligence could defeat Japanese operational security. The code breaking that enabled the American victory at Midway continued throughout the war, giving American commanders advance warning of Japanese plans and movements. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted messages revealing that Admiral Yamamoto would be flying to the Solomon Islands for an inspection tour. American fighters ambushed Yamamoto's aircraft and shot it down, killing the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most capable Japanese admiral. That ambush was possible only because of the same code-breaking capabilities that won at Midway. Fifth, Midway demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. Yamamoto brought 7 battleships to Midway, but they never fired a shot because the battle was decided by carrier aircraft hundreds of miles away. After Midway, battleships were relegated to supporting roles while carriers became the capital ships that determined control of the ocean. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. And finally, Midway gave the American military and the American people confidence that Japan could be defeated. After Pearl Harbor and 6 months of defeats, many Americans feared that Japan was unbeatable, that the Pacific War would last decades and cost millions of lives. Midway proved that American forces could defeat the Japanese when properly led and properly informed. The victory at Midway boosted American morale and convinced Americans that the sacrifices of war would lead to victory. The men who fought at Midway became heroes. Wade McClusky, who led the dive bombers that destroyed 3 carriers, was awarded the Navy Cross. The pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8, who died attacking the Japanese fleet, were posthumously awarded medals and became symbols of American courage and sacrifice. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued after floating in the ocean for 30 hours and became a celebrity, telling his story in interviews and lectures. Commander Rochefort and the station hypo codebreakers, whose work made the victory possible, remained anonymous because their work was classified and would remain classified for decades. Rochefort received no medal, no public recognition, nothing but a transfer to a desk job on the West Coast because some senior officers resented his success and his unconventional methods. It was not until 1986, 14 years after Rochefort's death, that the Navy finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal for his work at Midway. Justice delayed, but not entirely denied. The men who won the Battle of Midway were not superhuman. They were ordinary young Americans, most in their early 20s, who had enlisted or been drafted, trained as pilots or aircrew, and found themselves fighting a war in the Pacific thousands of miles from home. Wade McClusky, who led the Enterprise dive bombers and made the critical decision to follow the Japanese destroyer that led him to the carriers, was 39 years old, older than most Navy pilots, a graduate of the Naval Academy who had been flying for 15 years. McClusky was calm, methodical, professional, not given to emotional displays or dramatic gestures. He made his decision to follow the destroyer based on logic and intuition, gambling that the destroyer was heading toward the carriers because there was no other reason for a destroyer to be racing northwest at high speed. McClusky's gamble paid off, but if it had not, if the destroyer had been heading somewhere else, McClusky and his pilots would have run out of fuel and ditched in the ocean and died, and historians would call McClusky's decision a tragic mistake rather than a brilliant insight. The difference between heroism and failure is often nothing but luck and timing. Lieutenant Richard Best was one of the dive bomber pilots from Enterprise who attacked Akagi. Best was 28 years old, from New Jersey, a Naval Academy graduate who had been flying for 8 years. Best had already flown missions earlier in the war and had a reputation as an exceptionally skilled pilot. On June 4th, Best led a section of 3 dive bombers against Akagi and scored at least one direct hit that started the fires that destroyed the carrier. Best pulled out of his dive at low altitude, so low that the shrapnel from his own bomb hit his aircraft and damaged it. Best's aircraft was also hit by anti-aircraft fire, and he had to nurse the damaged plane back to Enterprise on one engine. Best landed successfully, but never flew combat again because he had inhaled caustic gas fumes from a faulty oxygen system during the dive, and the fumes permanently damaged his lungs. Best spent months in hospitals recovering, was medically retired from the Navy, and lived until 1991, dying at age 76 from the lung damage he sustained in those 3 minutes over Akagi. Best sacrificed his health and his career for those 3 minutes, and he did it without hesitation because that was what the mission required. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was 25 years old from Texas. Gay watched his entire squadron get shot down around him before his own aircraft was hit and crashed into the ocean. Gay swam away from the wreckage and hid under a floating seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle from the water. Gay watched the Japanese carriers burn and sink. He watched Japanese destroyers search for survivors. He stayed hidden in the water for 30 hours, drifting, fighting exhaustion and hypothermia, until he was finally spotted and rescued by an American patrol aircraft. Gay's survival was pure luck. The seat cushion kept him afloat. The water was warm enough that he did not die of hypothermia. Japanese destroyers searching the area did not spot him. Any of a dozen things could have killed him, but none did. Gay returned to the United States, was hailed as a hero, gave interviews and speeches, and returned to combat later in the war. Gay survived the war and became a commercial airline pilot, flying for TWA for 25 years. He died in 1994 at age 77, outliving most of his squadron mates by 50 years. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led Torpedo Squadron 8 to its destruction, was 41 years old, older than almost any Navy pilot, a career officer who had been in the Navy since 1924. Waldron was part Native American of Sioux descent, and he had the reputation of being stubborn, aggressive, and absolutely fearless. Waldron trained his squadron obsessively before Midway, drilling them on torpedo attack procedures, predicting that they would face overwhelming opposition and would have to attack alone without support. Waldron wrote a letter to his wife the night before the battle, a letter to be opened only if he did not return, in which he said that he believed his squadron would not survive the mission, but that they would do their duty regardless. Waldron was right. His entire squadron was destroyed, but their attack drew the Japanese fighters down to low altitude and created the opening for the dive bombers. Waldron and his men died knowing they were accomplishing nothing, seeing no results from their sacrifice. But they attacked anyway because those were their orders and because not attacking would mean abandoning the mission. That is courage at its purest, doing your duty even when success seems impossible and death seems certain. The Battle of Midway was won by pilots and aircrew, but it was made possible by codebreakers who worked in secret and received no public recognition for decades. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo worked 80-hour days for months breaking Japanese naval codes, intercepting and analyzing thousands of messages, building a picture of Japanese plans and intentions through fragments and clues. Rochefort was 42 years old in 1942, a Naval Academy graduate who had become interested in cryptanalysis and had specialized in it despite it being an unconventional career path for a Navy officer. Rochefort was eccentric, wearing a smoking jacket and slippers to work, living in the basement office, chained, smoking, surviving on coffee and cigarettes, obsessed with the puzzle of breaking Japanese codes. His colleagues described him as brilliant, abrasive, impatient with bureaucracy, dismissive of officers who did not understand intelligence work. Rochefort made enemies because he was right too often and because he did not suffer fools gladly. But he was undeniably the best cryptanalyst in the Navy. Breaking JN-25 was extraordinarily difficult because the code used a two-step encryption process. First, Japanese messages were encoded using a codebook that replaced words and phrases with 5-digit numbers. Then, those numbers were encrypted by adding other 5-digit numbers from a separate additive book. To read a message, the codebreakers had to reverse both steps, subtracting the additives and then translating the code groups back into Japanese words. The problem was that the codebreakers did not have the codebooks or the additive books. They had to reconstruct them through analysis of thousands of messages, looking for patterns, making guesses, testing hypotheses, gradually building up partial codebooks that allowed them to read fragments of messages. By April 1942, Station Hypo could read perhaps 15% of Japanese messages, enough to get the gist but not every detail. That was enough. The fragments revealed that Japan was planning a major operation in early June against a target code named AF. The AF water trap confirmed that AF was Midway. The intelligence allowed Nimitz to position his carriers perfectly. Without the code breaking, the American carriers would have been caught by surprise at Midway or would not have been there at all. After Midway, Rochefort expected recognition and promotion for his work. Instead, he was transferred to a desk job in San Francisco and denied promotion because senior officers in Washington resented his success and his direct communication with Nimitz that bypassed the normal chain of command. Rochefort's transfer was one of the great injustices of World War II, punishing success because it threatened bureaucratic egos. Rochefort served out the war in obscurity, retired in 1947, and died in 1976 without ever receiving proper recognition for his role in winning Midway. It was not until 1986, 10 years after Rochefort's death, that the Navy finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal. Rochefort's widow accepted the medal on his behalf. The award was decades too late, but better than nothing. The lesson of Rochefort's treatment is that institutions often fail to recognize their best people, that bureaucracy punishes innovation and independent thinking, that doing the right thing does not always lead to reward. Rochefort did the right thing and was punished for it. That he continued to serve despite the injustice says everything about his character. The Battle of Midway was a catastrophe for Japan, but the Japanese government and military leadership initially tried to hide the scale of the defeat from the Japanese people. Official announcements claimed that the battle had been a tactical withdrawal and that Japanese forces had inflicted heavy losses on the Americans. The truth that 4 carriers and 3,000 men had been lost was classified. The surviving sailors and pilots were ordered not to discuss the battle. Some were transferred to isolated posts where they could not spread information. The Japanese government feared that revealing the truth would damage morale and strengthen anti-war sentiment. So the lie was maintained. The Japanese people were told that the war was going well, that victories were being won, that American forces were being pushed back. The lie worked for a while because most Japanese civilians had no way to verify what they were being told. But the military leadership knew the truth. Admiral Yamamoto knew that Midway had been a disaster. He had gambled on destroying the American carriers and instead had lost 4 of his own carriers. Yamamoto understood immediately that Japan had lost the strategic initiative and could no longer win the war through offensive action. Japan's only hope now was to fight defensively, make the Americans pay a high cost for every island, and hope that America would eventually tire of the war and negotiate a peace. The carrier pilots and sailors who survived Midway were devastated by the defeat. These were men who had believed in their invincibility, who had won every battle since Pearl Harbor, who had been told they were the finest naval aviators in the world. The loss of 4 carriers in one day shattered their confidence. Pilots who had flown from the sunken carriers were reassigned to other ships, but many never recovered psychologically from the experience of watching their carriers burn and their friends die. Some became overly cautious in combat, their aggressiveness replaced by fear. Others became reckless, taking unnecessary risks because they no longer believed they would survive the war. Japanese military culture had no concept of combat stress or psychological trauma. Pilots who showed signs of fear or hesitation were considered weak or cowardly. There was no mental health support, no counseling, no recognition that watching thousands of men die in burning carriers might have psychological effects. The survivors were expected to carry on as if nothing had happened. Many could not. Suicide rates among returning Midway veterans were high, though exact numbers were never officially recorded. Admiral Nagumo, who commanded the carrier fleet at Midway, was blamed for the defeat by some officers who argued that he had been too cautious, that he had wasted time rearming his aircraft instead of launching immediate attacks, that better decisions could have prevented the disaster. Nagumo was relieved of carrier command and assigned to shore duty. He would later command Japanese forces at Saipan in 1944 and would commit suicide when American forces overran the island, choosing death over surrender. Nagumo's career ended at Midway, even though he survived the battle physically. The psychological burden of losing 4 carriers destroyed him as surely as if he had gone down with his flagship. Other Japanese officers involved in planning the Midway operation were also transferred or demoted, scapegoated for a defeat that was caused by American intelligence superiority rather than Japanese mistakes. The truth was that no amount of tactical brilliance could have overcome the American advantage of knowing exactly when and where the Japanese were coming. Japan lost Midway before the battle even began, lost it when Station Hypo broke J, N-25 and read the Japanese plans, lost it when the American carriers positioned themselves to ambush the Japanese fleet. The battle itself simply confirmed what the codebreakers had already determined, that Japan would lose this engagement. Everything that happened on June 4th was consequence, not cause. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's expansion stopped and America's counteroffensive began. Before Midway, Japan was winning. After Midway, Japan was losing. The change was not immediately obvious because Japan still controlled vast territories and had powerful forces, but the strategic momentum had shifted permanently. Japan was now fighting to hold what it had rather than fighting to conquer more. That shift from offense to defense is psychologically and strategically devastating because it means accepting that total victory is no longer possible. After Midway, Japan's best-case scenario was a negotiated peace that allowed them to keep some of their conquests. Even that best-case scenario became less likely as American industrial production accelerated and American forces grew stronger. By 1943, America was producing more aircraft in 1 month than Japan produced in an entire year. America was training more pilots in 1 year than Japan trained in 3 years. The industrial and demographic advantages that Yamamoto had feared before the war became reality after Midway. Japan could not replace its losses. America could replace its losses 10 times over. Midway also demonstrated the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The battle was won by codebreakers before it was won by pilots. The information provided by Station Hypo allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his forces perfectly, to achieve surprise even though he was outnumbered, to win a battle that Japan should have won. Intelligence continued to provide critical advantages throughout the Pacific War. American submarines, guided by intelligence on Japanese ship movements, sank over half of Japan's merchant fleet, strangling Japan's economy and military. American aircraft, directed by intelligence on Japanese troop concentrations, devastated Japanese forces before they could be deployed. American commanders, informed by intelligence on Japanese plans, repeatedly ambushed Japanese operations and turned Japanese advantages into defeats. Japan never regained the intelligence advantage after Midway. Station Hypo and other American code-breaking units raid Japanese communications throughout the war, while Japanese intelligence struggled to break American codes. The intelligence war was as important as the shooting war, and America won both. Midway changed the way the Navy thought about carriers and naval aviation. Before Midway, many officers still believed battleships were the most important warships and carriers were supporting vessels. Midway proved that carriers were the capital ships of modern naval warfare. The battle was decided by carrier aircraft, while the battleships Yamamoto brought to Midway never engaged. After Midway, America accelerated carrier construction, eventually building over 100 carriers of various types during the war. Japan built carriers too, but could never match American production. By 1944, America had so many carriers that they operated in task forces of 6 or 8 carriers together, overwhelming Japanese defenses through sheer numbers. Japan could never concentrate more than 2 or 3 carriers in any operation after Midway, because they did not have more carriers to concentrate. The carrier imbalance created by Midway became more extreme as the war continued until by 1945, American carriers operated off the coast of Japan itself with near impunity, while the few surviving Japanese carriers had no fuel and no pilots. Midway also established the pattern for the rest of the Pacific War. After Midway, the war became a series of island invasions, each one bringing American forces closer to Japan. Guadalcanal in August 1940, was the first step, a brutal 6-month battle that cost both sides dearly but established that America could take and hold Japanese-controlled territory. Then came the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each conquest paid for in blood, but each conquest bringing American bombers closer to Japanese cities. The island-hopping campaign was possible only because American carriers controlled the seas and provided air cover for the invasions. If Japan still had 4 carriers after Midway, if Japan still had naval air superiority, the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible or far more costly. Midway made everything that followed possible. 307 Americans died at Midway. Each of them has a story. Ensign Wesley Osmus was a pilot from Torpedo Squadron 8. His aircraft was shot down during the attack and he crashed into the ocean. Osmus survived the crash and was floating in the water when a Japanese destroyer picked him up. The Japanese crew interrogated Osmus, then tied weights to him and threw him overboard to drown. Osmus was 23 years old. Lieutenant Raymond Moore was a dive bomber pilot from Yorktown. His aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire during the attack on Hiryu. Moore crashed into the ocean and was killed on impact. He was 27 years old. Aviation machinist's mate Bruno Gado was a gunner on a dive bomber. After his aircraft was damaged in combat, Gado and his pilot were forced to ditch near the Japanese fleet. Both men were captured by a Japanese destroyer. The Japanese interrogated them, then tied them to water, filled gasoline cans and threw them overboard to drown. Gado was 24 years old. These men died horrible deaths far from home, died so that America could win a battle that changed the war, died so that future generations could live in freedom. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals with names and families and lives that were cut short. The families of the men who died at Midway received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands or brothers were missing in action, presumed dead. Many families hoped for months or years that their loved ones had survived and were prisoners of war, that eventually they would come home. Those hopes were cruel because most of the men who died at Midway were never captured. They died in the ocean or in burning aircraft. Their bodies never recovered. Their graves the Pacific Ocean itself. After the war, families were told that their loved ones' bodies were not recovered and were declared officially dead. No grave to visit, no body to bury, just a telegram and a folded flag and the knowledge that someone they loved had died far away doing his duty. The grief of those families is beyond measurement. Some parents never recovered from losing sons at Midway. Some wives never remarried, staying faithful to husbands who died in 1942. Some children grew up never knowing their fathers except through photographs and stories told by relatives. The cost of war is not measured in ships sunk or battles won. It is measured in the grief of families who lost someone they loved. The Japanese families also suffered. 3,500 Japanese sailors and pilots died at Midway. 3,500 families received notification that their sons or husbands or brothers were dead. Japanese military culture emphasized honor and duty and sacrifice for the emperor. So families were expected to be proud that their loved ones had died serving Japan. But pride does not ease grief. Japanese mothers cried for sons who would never come home. Japanese wives mourned husbands who died when their carriers sank. Japanese children grew up without fathers. The grief was the same regardless of nationality. War creates widows and orphans on both sides. The men who died at Midway, American and Japanese, were not evil. They were young men who served their countries and followed orders and died in a battle they did not start and could not control. Remembering Midway requires remembering not just the victory or the defeat, but the human beings who died there, the lives that were lost, the families that were shattered, the grief that continues across generations. The Battle of Midway is remembered as one of the most important naval battles in history, often compared to Trafalgar or Salamis, battles that changed the course of wars and determined the fate of nations. Midway determined that America, not Japan, would dominate the Pacific. That outcome shaped the entire post-war world. If Japan had won at Midway, if the American carriers had been destroyed, the Pacific War would have lasted years longer and cost millions more lives. Japan might have consolidated control over Asia and the Pacific. The atomic bombs might have been used on Japanese forces in occupied territory rather than on Japanese cities. The post-war world might have been divided differently. All of this is speculation, but it is reasonable speculation because Midway was genuinely decisive. The battle changed trajectories. Before Midway, Japan was ascending. After Midway, Japan was descending. The battle was a hinge point in history. Midway is studied in military academies around the world as an example of how intelligence, timing, and courage can overcome numerical superiority. The lesson taught is that battles are not won by the side with the most ships or the most aircraft, but by the side that uses its resources most effectively. American forces at Midway were outnumbered, but they had better intelligence, better positioning, and better timing. Those advantages were enough. The lesson is also that luck matters in war. Wade McClusky's decision to follow the Japanese destroyer was partially luck. The timing of the dive bombers arriving exactly when the Japanese fighters were at low altitude was luck. This sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 drawing the fighters down was not planned. It was consequence. War is chaotic and unpredictable, and luck plays a larger role than commanders like to admit. The difference between victory and defeat is often nothing but luck and timing and decisions made in seconds without full information. McClusky had no guarantee that following the destroyer would lead him to the carriers. He gambled. The gamble paid off. If it had not, historians would call him reckless rather than brilliant. Midway is also remembered as a victory for American cryptanalysis, proof that intelligence and mathematics can be as decisive as bombs and bullets. The codebreakers at Station Hypo won the battle before the pilots ever took off from their carriers. This lesson was learned and applied throughout the rest of World War II and beyond. The intelligence agencies created during the war, the NSA predecessors, grew from the code-breaking successes at Midway and elsewhere. The modern intelligence community, with its emphasis on signals intelligence and cryptanalysis, is the direct descendant of Station Hypo and Commander Rochefort's team. Every time the NSA breaks a terrorist organization's codes or reads an adversary's communications, they are using techniques pioneered at Midway. The battle's legacy extends far beyond World War II. Midway is commemorated every year on June 4th by the Navy and veterans organizations. Survivors of the battle, while they lived, attended ceremonies and told their stories to younger generations. George Gay spoke at Midway commemorations for decades, telling the story of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice. Wade McClusky received the Navy Cross and retired as a Rear Admiral, living until 1976. Richard Best lived until 1990, won despite his lung damage, long enough to see the 50th anniversary of the battle. The last Midway veteran died in 2021, ending the direct human connection to the battle. Now Midway lives only in memory and history, preserved in books and documentaries and museums. The wrecks of the Japanese carriers were found on the ocean floor, 4 ships lying in deep water, their aircraft still in their hangars, silent monuments to the 3,500 men who went down with them. The wrecks are war graves, protected by international law, reminders that battles have costs measured in human lives, not just strategic outcomes. The Battle of Midway was decided in 3 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers destroyed 3 Japanese aircraft carriers and broke Japan's naval supremacy forever. Those 3 minutes changed World War II, changed the Pacific, changed history. Before those 3 minutes, Japan was winning the Pacific War and America was losing. After those 3 minutes, the trajectory reversed. Japan was losing and America was winning. The change was permanent. Japan never recovered from Midway. Japan fought desperately for 3 more years but was never again on the offensive, never again threatened American positions, never again seemed capable of victory. America, by contrast, went from near defeat to overwhelming dominance in the 3 years following Midway, building hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft, training hundreds of thousands of sailors and pilots, projecting power across the Pacific until American forces stood on the beaches of Japan itself in 1945, ready to invade. The 3 minutes that changed the world were made possible by months of preparation, by codebreakers working in secret, by intelligence officers analyzing intercepted messages, by Admiral Nimitz trusting intelligence and positioning his carriers perfectly, by pilots training obsessively, by sailors and ground crew maintaining aircraft, by the sacrifice of torpedo bomber crews who died drawing Japanese fighters out of position, by Wade McClusky's decision to follow a destroyer, by timing and luck and courage. All of these elements had to align perfectly for those 3 minutes to be decisive. If any one element had been missing, the outcome would have been different. If Station Hypo had not broken GN-25, the American carriers would not have been in position. If Nimitz had not trusted the intelligence, he would not have sent his carriers into what looked like a trap. If the torpedo bombers had not attacked and died, the Japanese fighters would have been at high altitude to defend against dive bombers. If McClusky had not followed the destroyer, he would not have found the carriers in time. If the dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, they would have missed the moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. Everything had to happen exactly as it happened for the outcome to be what it was. The men who fought at Midway did not know they were fighting the most important battle of the Pacific War. They knew only that they had orders to attack the Japanese fleet, that the odds were against them, that many of them would not survive. They fought anyway because that was their duty, because their country asked them to, because their friends were fighting beside them, and they could not let their friends down. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing what must be done despite fear. The pilots who dived through anti-aircraft fire toward Japanese carriers were terrified, but they dived anyway. The torpedo bomber crews who flew into certain death to attack the Japanese fleet knew they were dying, but they attacked anyway. That is courage at its purest. That is heroism. Those men deserve to be remembered not as names on a monument, but as living human beings who made choices and faced death and did their duty knowing the cost. The Battle of Midway reminds us that history is made by human beings making decisions under impossible pressure with incomplete information. Wade McClusky had 15 minutes of fuel remaining and an empty ocean below him when he decided to follow a Japanese destroyer. That decision changed everything. If McClusky had turned back, if he had decided that continuing the search was too risky, the American dive bombers would not have found the Japanese carriers in time. The battle might have been lost, the war might have been prolonged, thousands more might have died, but McClusky did not turn back. He followed the destroyer, he found the carriers, he gave the order to attack. In doing so, he changed the world. History is full of moments like this. Moments when one person's decision determines outcomes far beyond anything they could imagine. McClusky could not have known that his decision would change the course of the Pacific War. He was just trying to complete his mission and bring his pilots home, but his decision mattered, his courage mattered, his willingness to gamble on intuition.